It's 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Breakfast. Our top stories this morning. Mixed messaging, COVID confusion ahead of New Year's Eve parties tonight as leading scientists warn of great concern over a lack of available tests.
Venues that are normally sold out 2 weeks ago are half sold out, and we're screaming in pain.
Reasons to be cheerful. Labour set out their vision for a new Britain in 2022 as Boris Johnson casts a positive outlook on the year ahead.
We can say one thing with certainty. Our position this December the 31st is incomparably better than last year.
They must be brought to justice. Ghislaine Maxwell's victims say attention should now turn to her and Jeffrey Epstein's accomplices.
I'm in New York, where Ghislaine Maxwell is being held inside the Brooklyn Metropolitan Detention Centre. She'll remain here until she's sentenced next year.
A warning for the White House. Vladimir Putin tells Joe Biden not to impose new sanctions over Ukraine.
The world is full of beauty, and it's up to you to capture it, Louis.
Sky News speaks to the stars of the new film celebrating the life of 19th century artist Louis Wain and his feline friends. The weather exceptionally mild for New Year's Eve, but unsettled in the north with rain, mostly fine for England and Wales. And at 1:45, we'll take a look at the morning's papers. Today I'll be joined by the editor of Spike magazine, Tom Slater, and the author, Nikki Hodgson. Hello there, a very good morning. I'm Jonathan Samuels. The government is being accused of mixed messaging ahead of New Year's Eve celebrations tonight. Despite not bringing in further restrictions ahead of one of the biggest nights of the year, Boris Johnson has warned revellers in England to be cautious as they head out and take a test if they can. But there's still a shortage of lateral flow and PCR tests, with calls for health staff to be given priority access. Meanwhile, health leaders have warned that up to 40% of vaccine appointments at the moment are no-shows. Sky's Sajid Chowdhury reports.
With just a day before the new year comes in, it's unusual for Alex Proud to have time for a television interview. But there's not much else to do.
Look, there's hardly any staff needed. We're not sold out. And that story is the same across the country. You know, venues that are normally sold out 2 weeks ago are half sold out, and we're screaming in pain.
Alex says confusion over what is and isn't safe is driving business away from his club and country.
This is one of the few things Britain really is famous for. It's nighttime industry, whether it's Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow or London. This is what we're famous for. And we destroy this. You're taking half the reason people come to Britain.
Unlike in other parts of the UK, in England, the Prime Minister has given big indoor New Year celebrations the go-ahead. In London, there'll be no fireworks to thunder through the city. But there will be one sound reminiscent of a time without COVID.
The last time we heard Big Ben ring in a new year, well, that was long before the pandemic. This time it'll chime in yet another uncertain year ahead, when there are rising COVID cases and mounting concern about people mixing over New Year's celebrations when there's a shortage of COVID tests.
Scientists say crowded indoor parties are the perfect conditions for spreading COVID.
I find it odd, really, that we're in a situation where we're worried enough about the wave of Omicron to build new Nightingale capacity, but we're not worried enough to suggest to people that New Year's Eve parties are not a good idea.
As England parties, the government hopes the booster shot will be enough to keep us all safe. It says the target to offer one to every eligible adult has been reached. Though, of course, that doesn't mean every person given the chance necessarily took it. Around 7 in 10 adults have now had a booster, but many more will need to, as the UK seeks to beat COVID in the year ahead. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News, in Westminster.
Well, even though there aren't any restrictions in place in England for New Year's Eve tonight, that's not the case in the other nations of the UK. Pub landlords in Wales and Scotland look set to have their profits slashed as regular punters travel over the border to bring in 2022 free of restrictions. And at 9:10, we'll speak to some of those pub landlords on England's borders with Wales and Scotland who are braced for what will be very different New Year's Eves this evening. And as the nation prepares to see in 2022, political leaders have been setting out their hopes and visions for the new year. Boris Johnson said in the fight against COVID-19, the UK is in an incomparably better position than 12 months ago, whilst the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said he believes the best still lies ahead for Britain.
Happy New Year. 2022 is almost upon us, and whatever the challenges that fate continues to throw in our way, and whatever the anxieties we may have about the weeks and months ahead, particularly about Omicron and the growing numbers in hospitals, we can say one thing with certainty. Our position this December the 31st is incomparably better than last year.
Given the last 2 years our country's been through, it would be all too easy to lose heart. But like you, I believe in Britain. I believe the best still lies ahead for Britain. That if we make the right choices, together we can seize the future and make it work for every family in every part of Britain. That must be the true legacy of our sacrifices and pain of the last 2 years in the pandemic.
Well, we can take a look now at the latest COVID data. There were 189,213 new cases of COVID-19 reported in the UK over 24 hours. 146,604 of those new cases were in England. Another 332 deaths have been reported within 28 days of a positive test. That brings the total number of deaths in the UK to 148,421. The high number of deaths reported on Thursday does include a backlog of hospital death data from the NHS between the 24th and the 29th of December. Well, as of Wednesday, there were 11,898 people in hospital in the UK with COVID-19, more than 1,000 more than the previous day, and the highest total since early March. However, this is still well below the peak of more than 38,000 in January, and the number of people on ventilators remains steady at 868. 32,607 people have received their first dose of a vaccine, with 43,766 getting their second. That means that nearly 47.4 million people have now received their second dose. Onto the boosters, 435,293 new boosters or third jabs were reported in the latest 24-hour period. More than 33.5 million people have now had one of those. Well, away from coronavirus, they must be brought to justice, is the message from the victims of Ghislaine Maxwell, who have spoken out of their relief at the guilty verdicts of her trial in New York. Maxwell was found guilty of 5 out of 6 counts she faced, including sex trafficking a minor for the late billionaire Jeffrey Epstein to abuse. As she awaits her sentencing, attention has now turned to blowing the whistle on Maxwell's and Epstein's other accomplices, who survivors believe were involved in the scandal. Sky's US correspondent Martha Kellner reports now from New York.
Ghislaine Maxwell travelled on private planes between mansions on sprawling estates. But inside these homes, she and Jeffrey Epstein orchestrated a sex trafficking operation. Teenagers from fractured families singled out for sexual abuse and brought here. Virginia Giuffre says she was trafficked around the world and forced to have sex with famous men, including Prince Andrew, claims he denies.
Where I'm at is just grateful because we were told constantly, you know, these people will never go to jail. They're too powerful, they're too rich, and we live in a new day. And it just goes to show that, you know, this is not the end. This is just the beginning.
This former federal prosecutor believes Maxwell will spend the rest of her life in prison unless she can cut a deal. Is there any chance that Ghislaine Maxwell's sentence could be commuted if she were to blow the whistle, for example, on co-conspirators?
there certainly is a process where individuals can cooperate after conviction and get credit for that cooperation. In this case, I haven't seen any indication that that's going to happen. She would have to bring some incredibly valuable information to the table for the government to want to meet with her.
After the verdict was handed down, Ghislaine Maxwell was brought back here to the Brooklyn Metropolitan Detention Centre, where she spent the past 18 months of her life. I've just spoken to her personal lawyer, Leah Safin, who was dropping off legal papers in the building behind me. She said she'd not been allowed to see Maxwell, but repeated to me allegations that she's being subjected to what she called cruel and unusual punishments inside here. Annie Farmer's testimony was key to bringing down Maxwell, but it wasn't just the women who took the stand in this case whose lives were devastated.
Only 4 victims testified, and they were very brave to do so. But it's estimated that there may have been 160 or more victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and a number of them may also have been victims of Ms. Maxwell.
They were partners in crime, 2 sexual predators, but survivors believe there were more involved in this scheme, for whom justice is also long overdue. Martha Kellner, Sky News, New York.
And Martha has the latest for us now from New York.
Ghislaine Maxwell faces a total maximum of 65 years in prison. Her lawyers and her family are keen that that sentencing process happens as soon as possible so she can be moved away from this facility to another elsewhere in the country, which they hope will be more comfortable. Her family insist on her innocence. They're defiant and say that she's being scapegoated for the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. But this is not the end of the story as far as the legal process goes for Ghislaine Maxwell. She still faces 2 outstanding perjury charges. It may be, though, that federal prosecutors opt to lay those to one side because they've been so successful in this initial prosecution and because it seems likely that Ghislaine Maxwell will already spend the rest of her life behind bars.
Martha Kellner there. Now, US President Joe Biden has spoken to his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, amid continuing concerns over the build-up of Russian troops at the Ukrainian border. It's the second time this month that the 2 leaders have discussed the issue. Sky Security and Defence editor Deborah Haynes joins me now. So, Deborah, the 2 men having this phone conversation, do we know what was discussed?
Well, it seems as though the issues that they went through were quite similar to the conversation that they had earlier in the month. But the fact that the 2 leaders are talking is hugely significant at this time of heightened crisis over Ukraine and concerns, particularly in the United States and the UK, at the potential for a possible Russian invasion, a further invasion of Ukraine in the new year. Now, specific details in terms of actual negotiating points haven't emerged, and Joe Biden repeated the threats that the United States has made that any further military action by Russia into Ukraine would be met with unprecedented sanctions. But President Putin retorted to this, saying that any sanctions now or later by the United States could lead to a complete breakdown in relations between the US and Russia, which would be something that he said would be seen as a huge mistake by future generations. So a sign there of the Russian leader setting his position in response to any further American action. But the key message from the United States is that any progress in diplomacy has to happen at a time of de-escalation. And at the moment, we're just not seeing any sign of that around Ukraine, where around 100,000 Russian troops have been building. But on the Russian side, they have asked very clearly that they want guarantees that the United States and its NATO allies won't be posing a threat to its borders. They make the point that how would the United States like it if weapons from another country were put close to its borders? Obviously, the US says that any actions around that area by NATO are purely defensive, but that doesn't wash with Russia. But this dialogue was all about really setting the scenes for some important diplomatic moves that are going to be happening early in the new year between the 2 sides.
Yeah, we'll see how things develop in 2022. Deborah, thank you very much. Now, with the surge in Omicron cases starting to translate to increased hospitalisations, pressure is mounting on the health service once again. But there are fears that a shortage of COVID-19 rapid tests is leaving the NHS hamstrung, with thousands of healthcare workers now having to self-isolate. Joining me is the chair of the British Medical Association, Dr. Chand Nagpal. Great to see you this morning on this New Year's Eve. So just explain to me how much of an issue NHS staff absence is at the moment.
This is a significant problem, because when you have such high levels of Omicron in the community, NHS staff are also affected. In fact, in the period before Christmas, we had seen a 50% increase in staff absence due to COVID across the country. Now, today, when the new figures are published, I think that will be even higher. In London, in particular, which is a good example of where the problem lies, is that we've seen up to about 3 times increase in staff absence from either infection or isolation in some London hospitals. Now that's creating huge pressure on the system when we already are short-staffed at the busiest time of the year. And to add to that problem, we now have the situation where many staff cannot get their lateral flow tests or a PCR test, which means that they can't return to work, because what they need to return to work is to demonstrate a negative lateral flow test on day 6 and 7, which was specially introduced so that we could shorten the period of isolation. So this is creating enormous problems for us. And for the workforce that remains, they're having to carry out the work of their absent colleagues, and that's adding additional strain and stress. But patients are therefore going to suffer as a result.
Yeah, now the Department of Health says that the NHS has its own dedicated supply channel when it comes to getting tests. Is that not working?
Unfortunately, we've had reports from across the country of healthcare staff who have not been able to access their tests and results, and as a result, they haven't been able to provide the evidence that they are able to return to work. In some cases, there's been a delay where, for example, they could have returned to work on, say, yesterday, but because of the lack of being able to have a test, they've had to, delay that day by day, and that just means that you're, for example, in a GP practice, you're having to cancel an entire GP clinic surgery, or you're going to have to cancel a whole session of taking of a staff member who might be taking bloods, like a healthcare assistant, having to cancel her clinic or his clinic. So, this is the sort of reality we're having to face at the moment.
Yeah, it's a real worry. The Health Secretary is saying that supplies will be constrained for a fortnight due to demand, so it's not going to go away immediately. Just while we've got you on, let me ask you about something else that's in the newspapers this morning. The head of NHS providers says that they don't believe more curbs are needed. Numbers are going up of coronavirus cases, but serious illness amongst the elderly hasn't risen significantly. That's cause for optimism, isn't it?
I think, we need to really watch the data very carefully. What's concerning is that we are seeing significant increases in people in hospital. In fact, we now, yesterday, the number of people admitted and also the number of patients in hospital, is at a level as high as during the lockdown earlier this year in spring, in sort of February, March. Now, that's a significant number, and it's increasing. So whilst the proportion of people who end up in hospital as a result of Omicron is smaller, we're definitely seeing significant increases. And the trouble is that those increases in hospitalization mean that other patients, and 6 million people are on a waiting list at the moment. It's a record for the NHS. 312,000 have been waiting more than 12 months. It means that they can't then be treated in hospital because their beds are being occupied by other patients. 25,000 patients were admitted with COVID in a 4-week period before Christmas. Those are 25,000 beds that could have been available available for other patients. So
sorry to interrupt. That's 25,000 people who are admitted to hospital because of COVID or for other reasons and just happen to have COVID or get COVID.
Right now, okay, that's a very good question. And in fact, that's data that I don't have and data that we really do need to is important to be made available. Yeah. Because I absolutely agree. We need to differentiate between the two. We don't have that data.
OK, all right. We will leave it there and we wish you a happy new year. Dr. Chan Nagpal, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, a murder investigation has been launched after a 15-year-old boy was stabbed to death in a park in South London. Police were called to Ashburton Park in Croydon just after 7 o'clock last night. It's the 29th teenage killing in the capital this year, the highest since 2008. Sky's Milena Veselinovic is in the newsroom for us. Just awful, this case. What are the details?
Really horrible, Jonathan. The police officers gave the boy first aid before the emergency services, the ambulance service, arrived, but sadly he was pronounced dead at 7:36 p.m. Now, formal identification has not yet taken place, but the police said that the boy's family have been notified and a post-mortem will be held in due course. The police also said that no one has yet been arrested for this, and as you say, this is just the latest in a string of teenage homicides in London this year, 29, with the youngest victim of stabbing being just 14 years old. This deadly toll equals the peak from 2008. Now, the police say that they are throwing all the resources that they have behind investigating teenage homicides. And they also say that they're not taking stabbings lightly, that they're not being complacent about this. But every single time something like this happens, there's a heartbroken family left behind. And there's also a community asking what could have been done to prevent something like this from happening.
Milena, thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making news this morning. And a state of emergency has been declared in the US state of Colorado after wildfires burned hundreds of homes near Denver. At least 6 people have been injured, with tens of thousands now told to evacuate. The blazes started on Thursday morning and have quickly spread due to strong winds of up to 105 miles an hour. Now, COVID isolation can be unpleasant at the best of times, but one woman has shared her ordeal of isolating in a plane toilet. Marissa Fateo tested positive for COVID during her flight from Chicago to Iceland and decided to lock herself in the loo for 5 hours to protect the other passengers. She captured her journey of confinement in the tiny cubicle in a TikTok video that's been viewed more than 3 million times.
I started having a severe sore throat. And so I just took my rapid test and I brought it into the bathroom, and within what felt like 2 seconds, there were 2 lines. There's like 150 people on this flight. And my biggest fear was giving it to them.
Research has uncovered a Masonic connection to why revellers around the world link arms when they sing Auld Lang Syne at New Year. A study of Robert Burns' best-loved song links to the practice to Freemasonry, where singing with arms crossed and hands joined was a parting ritual in many lodges. And I bet you still don't know the words. Thousands of people in England will be flooding to the pubs and clubs later to see out 2021 with no restrictions in place. But the situation in Scotland and Wales, of course, isn't quite as jolly, with restrictions interrupting usual New Year celebrations. Well, Greg Mulholland is the campaign director at Campaign for Pubs, and he joins me now. Nice to see you. Thanks for being with us. Tricky times, isn't it? Talk to me about tonight. What are pub managers saying about the differing restrictions depending on where you live?
Well, it's incredibly frustrating for publicans, particularly, of course, publicans who are just on the Scottish side of the Scotland-England border, or the Welsh side of the England-Wales border. You have situations where, in some cases, people's nearest pub is actually in the other country. But there's a huge temptation for people in Scotland, in Wales, to travel over the border to have a New Year without restrictions. And that's a further blow, actually, for Scottish and Welsh publicans, on top of the very difficult December. And that's a difficult December for all publicans in the UK. So this was entirely predictable and is something that will happen. And I'm afraid that it hasn't really been coordinated in the whole of the UK.
Yeah, so anecdotally, you're hearing exactly that, are you? That lots of pub goers and clubbers are literally going to nip over the border for a night out?
Well, I think we have to be, more realistic. There are many people who live in Scotland and live in Wales who have family and friends in England. Many of them have already travelled. Many of them are staying with those friends and family, and perfectly reasonably to do so. And of course, we'll be taking advantage of being able to go out without restrictions. So yes, there will be some people who will travel, but equally there are some people who, as I say, who actually live in Wales and in Scotland, and their nearest towns, in some cases even their nearest pubs. I was down in a community that is on the River Wye, and there are houses in Wales in the same community and their local pubs in England. There's actually another pub just on the other side of the river over a bridge that will have different restrictions. So, you cannot possibly say to anyone in that community that they cannot go to one or other of the pubs, and yet they have entirely different rules and are both accessible and both a matter of a few minutes walk. So yes, this will happen inevitably, and it shows, frankly, that we need a little bit more common sense. We also have to remember that publicans have all the way through this done their very best to keep people safe, to ensure places are ventilated. And actually, we would argue that pubs are safer than people gathering at homes anyway. So we are relaxed about this. And frankly, we think ministers should be too. But pubs do need a good new year. They need that because the next month, January, is always one of the toughest ones. And it's a tough time for pubs and hospitality anyway.
Yeah, such an important time of year, isn't it? Christmas and New Year. You've written a letter to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. What are you calling for?
Well, the reality is that obviously the Chancellor came forward belatedly, it has to be said, with an announcement of some grants for hospitality in England. But those grants, and many pubs will receive just £2,700, they hardly cover the loss of a weekend, in many cases the loss from a usual night in December. And December has been anything but usual for hospitality because of Omicron and because of government announcements. So if the government, and actually all governments, if they're serious about wanting to keep alive our pub culture, to support our pubs through this ongoing pandemic, and it very much is still sadly ongoing and has to be dealt with, then there has to be further financial support. And there has to be further financial support if there are any more restrictions in any of the 4 home nations of the UK, and governments have to have that at the forefront of their decision. And they can do that in various ways. They can do that by cancelling business rates, by having a lower rate of VAT for all pub sales, which is not the case. It's only for food at the moment. So there are various ways that the governments can support pubs going forward. And if they want them to get through another difficult winter until we finally get to the other side of that pandemic, then they need to do so. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we will see more pub businesses failing.
Yeah, and nobody wants to see that, of course. All right, well, we wish you the very best for 2022. It's been a really tough 12 months. We raise a glass to you as we head into next year. Greg Mulholland, thank you very much indeed. Nice to speak to you. Now it's less than 6 hours until Australia bids farewell to 2021 and welcomes in the new year. And despite rising COVID cases, Sydney's still going ahead with its annual fireworks display.
It was certainly a possibility that the fireworks might have been cancelled. In fact, many revellers in Sydney and indeed in Australia are choosing to watch the fireworks from the comfort of their homes. That's as COVID cases rapidly rise. In the past 24 hours in New South Wales alone, 21,151 new infections have been reported. That's the same amount that was detected in all of Australia yesterday. So we are certainly certainly seeing that rapid spread of the Omicron variant. However, the number of hospitalisations and also patients admitted to ICU remains relatively low and quite stable. So authorities are reassured by that. Also, around 95% of Australia's population is fully vaccinated. So authorities are advising residents, if they're going out, to take every precaution to be safe, but certainly to enjoy the new year. I'm here at Blues Point in Sydney, one of Sydney's best vantage points, as you can see behind me. It typically would be a lot busier than what we're seeing at the moment, particularly at this time of day. The fireworks are due to start at 9 p.m. for families, and at 12 a.m. they will be obviously the big show spectacular. But we're not seeing the crowds that we would be seeing usually in a pre-COVID era. The Prime Minister has advised that this is life under COVID, however, and residents should do their very best to ring in the new year and say goodbye to what's been a pretty crummy 2021, particularly with some of the strict COVID measures that we've seen and also some of the world's toughest lockdown restrictions.
Oh, lovely clear blue sky, sun shining on the Opera House there in Sydney. Let's see how it's looking here.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Not as hot as Sydney, but it's still incredibly mild for this time of year with spring-like temperatures, but it'll also be wet and windy at times. Winter returns with colder temperatures in the early days of 2022. Well, this morning, rain lies across Northern Ireland, along with central and southern Scotland. There's a secondary rain belt sweeping eastwards across England and Wales. It'll be a mild start to the day away from the chilly north, but also windy with gusts up to 55 miles an hour. Southern parts of the country will become largely fine, with bright or sunny spells developing. Meanwhile, rain over central Scotland.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Did you know if more of us walked, rode bikes and scooted to school, we would make a big difference to the air pollution around our school? Yeah, like us.
2021 is going to come to a very mild end, but it will also be windy and unsettled. Early rain clearing east will leave a largely fine day for England and Wales, whilst rain over central southern Scotland will ease. Further rain spreads northeast from Ireland later, giving a rather wet New Year's Eve for Scotland. These wet and windy conditions will help to keep air quality high, with levels only reaching 1 or 2 on the Air Pollution Index.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Time for a look at this morning's papers, and joining me are the editor of Spike magazine, Tom Slater, and the author, Nikki Hodgson. Great to see you both again. I hope all things are well this New Year's Eve. Why don't we start, Nikki, with the hospitality sector? It's a real issue, isn't it? I've just been speaking to Greg, who is one of the industry leaders, saying that it's such a depressing time and they don't really know where they stand, given the differing restrictions depending on where you live.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the hospitality industry has been absolutely savaged by COVID. And I say that as someone who's married to a hospitality owner. So we really have been through the ringer these past couple of years with things. I think what is tricky is that this Christmas, you know, everybody was kind of primed and primed for a really good festive season. And then Omicron just kind of drifted in at the worst possible moment for the industry and for the government to decide about whether to take restrictions or not. Obviously, Boris Johnson hasn't done that in England, but in Wales and Scotland, we do have these restrictions. But even so, takings this year have still been 60% down on 2019. So, you know, 2 bad years. What's really important about this time of year for the hospitality industry is that it allows it to build its cash reserves for the quiet months of January and February. And obviously it hasn't been able to do that for 2 years running. So smaller businesses like pubs, like single bars, have just got absolutely no chance at this stage. You know, they're not really getting any financial assistance. It's very, very minimal. It's certainly not enough to boost them through what has just been a terrible 18 months for them. And so we're just going to see even more businesses probably go bust in the new year, which is not really the way many people want to start 2022.
Yeah, Tom, just before we move on to the front of the Times, is the government doing enough, do you think, to help the hospitality sector?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because no new restrictions have been brought in, and yet even just the mood music coming from government obviously has a huge impact on people's willingness to go out and all the rest of it. So you just hope more support can be forthcoming, because of the fact that everyone would lose out if, you know, a huge section of the hospitality industry just didn't make it through this last winter. So it's a very serious problem. Definitely.
Yeah, you're right. Well, staying with a similar sort of theme, front of the Times, COVID curbs. There's no need for any more, according to NHS chief. Certainly, looking at the data as it stands right now, it would appear that maybe the government has done the right thing by not clamping down further.
Well, exactly. There's actually quite a lot of good news out there, believe it or not, if people are willing to see past the kind of quite concerning case numbers, in that a lot of the kind of fundamentals are so different to where we were last year. It's easy to have that sense of deja vu. And yet, as Chris Hopson from NHS Providers, as well as a bunch of other people who are either experts or on the front line, have been pointing out to us recently, is that because of the vaccine defences, because we're not in the position that we were in last year, that the number of cases that we're seeing, and even some of the hospitalisation figures in recent days, are not going to carry on, and they're certainly not going to turn into the kind of tidal wave of hospitalisations and deaths that we saw last year. You know, people are spending a lot less time in hospital than they did in previous waves. There's also been a huge rise, as Chris Hopson has pointed out, in what they call kind of incidental COVID infections. So a large chunk of those numbers are people who might have gone in with a broken leg or because they fell off of their bike, but test positive upon arrival, and therefore they make their way into the figures, and these things aren't disaggregated. So there's really a lot to be positive about going into this new year, actually. Obviously, we have to be cautious. The virus has surprised us before, all the rest of it, but the vaccines really do work. And the fact that we're seeing, even from NHS leaders, this conviction that we don't need more draconian restrictions on our lives, that this is a problem that can be managed, is something that a lot of people can take with genuine hope into the new year, I think.
Yeah, we all need that, don't we, as we head into 2022. Just looking at the front of the Daily Star, Nikki, if we want to keep free of restrictions, then we do need to be able to test ourselves and make sure that we're in the clear. And we know there is a big problem with testing kits at the moment. And here on the front of the Star, they're talking about cowboys charging £210 for a kit. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it's a jokey headline, but there is a serious point underneath this story, which is that, you know, people are taking advantage of the fact you can't get hold of lateral flow tests. They're being sold online for £210, which is just, you know, it's completely immoral, really, isn't it, as well as being extortionate. And I think the even more serious problem down the line, potentially, is that if we can't get on top of the supply issue, there could become a genuine problem with the quality of the tests out there. I mean, what's stopping anybody who's a bit of a charlatan putting together some kind of proxy test and then selling that for a price? And that would be really, really damaging to our testing situation across the UK and to the figures that we know that, you know, the figures that we know are real or not about COVID.
Yeah, the picture there of Del Boy Trotter's testing kits. I mean, Tom, do you think there's an argument to concentrate fully on the lateral flow test rather than the PCR test? Almost scrap the PCR tests, which take a long time to come back, which are hard to get hold of anyway. And we know that lateral flows are perhaps better than we initially thought at telling you whether or not you've got COVID.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky one insofar as you say, lateral flows are great, particularly for catching what you at your most infectious. PCR tests obviously are a lot more sensitive, so people tend to use those as almost like a follow-up to a lateral flow test to confirm. But it's obvious that, you know, there needs to be this kind of mix of the two, I suppose. And the issue at the moment is the fact that because the government has urged people to be testing themselves even when they haven't got any symptoms, then naturally the people where they're most needed, it's just been missing at the moment. I mean, I think it is worth remembering, though, that one of the things we have done well in this country is testing. You saw recently queues around the block in America of people just trying to get a lateral flow test. So whilst these pinches have been significant and Omicron has really set that up for us, this has been one of the things I think we've done better than we might like to imagine in some ways.
OK. Now, Nikki, Paris U-turn lets expat Britons return to EU homes via France. This is a welcome move, isn't it? But then still banning Brits from going directly to France. Is that right?
I don't know, actually, because I think this might be Tom's story.
Oh, this is Tom's story. All right, Tom, do you want to tell us about this?
Of course, no. So this has been rumbling on for a couple of days now. So British people who live in the EU will now be able to return home via France. Paris had previously brought in this ban effectively on expats transiting through the country by road. We saw many of these kind of viral stories of people trying to get back to their homes in the European Union, but being turned away by a Eurotunnel, in particular between Folkestone and Calais. It seems that sources in the Telegraph story said that French border police had been told to interpret the existing guidance in a pretty draconian fashion, were turning away a lot of passengers. But this has now been eased, thankfully, which will be a huge relief to those people trying to get back to their homes. And a lot of criticism, I think, on the French government, given the fact that certainly whilst Omicron is taking off in this country, you know, the rise in France has been more or less pretty similar over the course of recent days. So the utility of this wasn't entirely clear, given the fact that it would affect so many people and cause so much distress over the festival.
Yeah, and Omicron's so widespread now, it does sort of make it all seem a bit pointless. All right, let's talk about New Year's Eve very quickly. Nikki, this story in the Times. How are Britain's middle classes going to spend their celebrations tonight?
Well, apparently they're all going to be having dinner parties, and that's based on data from Waitrose, where they found that searches for New Year's Eve recipes were up 160% this year on waitrose.com than they were last year. I think really important point, though, is that we were locked down last year. So if people were cooking, they were only cooking for their immediate family. So, you know, it is actually finally a chance to go out and to have that fun. But apparently, really interesting here, most people will be having pavlova for pudding. Searches for the recipe for pavlova are up 1,500%.
Wow, I love pavlova. Excellent. It's going to be very warm as well, 15 degrees Celsius, according to The Sun. Tom and Nikki, thank you both very much indeed.